Welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet, the go-to podcast for parents with multiple kids, especially those with twins, triplets, or more, who are navigating the maze of modern family life and personal finance. Whether you're overwhelmed by education or retirement planning, parenting dilemmas, career transitions, or trying to define your purpose and plan, we're here to guide you with empathy, encouragement, and expertise. Hosted by Paul Fenner, founder of Tama Capital, a certified financial planner and parent to 4 kids, including a set of triplets. Our podcast is your ally in the quest for financial peace of mind, proving that money matters, but family comes first. Subscribe now and join our community of empowered parents at tamacapital.com. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. Clients of Tama may retain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
What does comprehensive financial planning even mean? At Tama Capital, it means a family office where lifestyle planning such as retirement, college, portfolio management, and tax prep and planning are all under one umbrella. But it goes beyond numbers. We focus as much on the emotional side of financial planning as we do on the financial side. We get you. We understand your challenges of building a family, business or career, and a healthy life. We are devoted to wealth planning for families like yours because we are you. Learn how our family can help your family by visiting tamacapital.com. Do you ever wonder why fear takes over when we try to gain traction when it comes to our physical or financial health? Dr. Teryn Clarke, our resident neurologist expert, is back to discuss why negative feedback loops are stronger than positive ones, thus making change difficult. Making changes is challenging due to the conflict between our primitive lizard brain, focused on immediate gratification, and the human prefrontal cortex, part of our brain, which is capable of long-term planning. Successful habit formation requires a 3-pronged approach: resetting our mindset, implementing tiny habits, and providing self-rewards. It's this internal feedback loop, if you will. With insights from books like Atomic Habits by James Clear, Dr. Teryn explains how tiny, incremental changes can lead to significant, lasting improvements. Additionally, we cover how visualizing long-term success using tools like habit trackers, can help solidify new behaviors. Listen as we uncover strategies for overcoming fear to harness the benefits of time and especially compounding in not only our health, but our financial lives. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Teryn Clarke. Well, Dr. Teryn, welcome back. I think I'm really enjoying these monthly chat of ours. It's been eye-opening to learn about brain health. And today, the topic of conversation is going to be centered around why people are afraid to take that first step. And we started talking about this in our previous conversation about seed oils, which I'll link back to our show notes. But that's one thing that I think comes up not only with our health, both physically and mentally, but a challenge that I see often in the financial planning world where people, when they finally decide to make that phone call to me or schedule a meeting, I don't necessarily know the why as of yet, but I know that it took a lot for them to be able to pick up the phone and schedule that initial conversation, especially to talk to, at that point, potentially a complete stranger about the intimate details of their financial well-being per se. So it's something I've always been interested in and struggle with in trying to help people is to, take that first step. And I think one of the aspects we began talking about last conversation was how do we take something big like retirement or getting healthy, again, physically, mentally, and be able to break that down into smaller bite-sized steps where it's not so overwhelming. So I'm really interested to get your take on that and how our brain works to be able to do all of that.
Yeah, I think it has been really fun to talk with you and to realize how many things really mesh in between the brain and financial planning and planning for the future. And this is one of those areas where when you understand the structures of the brain, it makes perfect sense why people would have trouble reaching out to start financial planning, planning for the future. It's really a battle of the lizard brain versus the human brain. And so, we can talk about that because I think once you understand why you do the things you do, it really opens up the pathways to help you make changes. So if do you want me to just jump into like some of the things that are making us resistant?
It's interesting you use the term lizard brain because I've that comes up in a lot of the reading and research that I do, but I don't know if the audience will be familiar with what that means. So can you
Yeah,
maybe start there and elaborate on what that
sure.
means and then dive into the details?
Yeah. So when we talk about the lizard brain, a lot of times I'll refer to it as the dog brain because we can train ourselves to override some of those habits. So most of us have trained a dog, but probably not a lizard. But when we're talking about either the lizard or the dog brain, we're talking about that primitive brain, those structures that have us going on autopilot, habits for survival. And so there's really three main structures involved in that. And we have those structures in our brain. Dogs have them, lizards have them, worms have them. So they're really primordial. They're very basic, but they've been with us through millennia and millions of years. And so they're super hardwired. So there's three of those. One of them is the basal ganglia. That's involved in deeply ingrained habits. So that's where we are just going to stay in the status quo. That's what its baseline is. And it's very deep. It's very hard to rewire because it's getting inputs from two other very primitive structures. One is called the striatum. And as soon as I explain these, we'll kind of drop the name. So you don't need
Okay,
to
yeah.
remember them. The
Those names are going
striatum.
right over the top of my head.
Yeah. These are just three. Just know there's three structures. There's one that's running the habits on a loop. So maybe it's kind of like a CPU in a computer. And
Okay.
then this other one, the striatum, is working on dopamine, which is our pleasure molecule in our brain. And that's the one that gives positive reinforcement. It's our reward system, but it's very much just set to instant gratification. So we're getting positive reinforcement from that structure into our lizard brain or dog brain. And then we also have a negative structure called the amygdala, which primarily functions based on fear and anxiety. And it gives us negative feedback. So, if we step back and think about people calling you to have you look at their finances, deeply personal, a lot of people are going to feel maybe shame that they haven't planned enough, embarrassment that they don't have much set aside, or that maybe they tried to invest on their own and they lost money. And that fear and anxiety reinforcement, the negative feedback, is actually stronger in terms of forming habits than is the positive dopamine. So we already have a little bit of a set where shame is going to override, even if somebody's called and had advice financially before and it was a positive experience, that negative feedback loop is still going to be stronger in terms of preventing people from pushing through and knowing that there's a reward down the line, but getting through that negative. And so what do we have that dogs don't have as much of? Lizards don't have it all. Dogs have a little bit. It's called a prefrontal cortex, what makes our brain so big compared to most other animals. And that's where we have planning, especially planning for the future, things that have very delayed gratification, where you have to override those primitive structures and say, okay, you know what? Today, it's not going to be instant gratification that I'm not spending money. Spending money is instant gratification. Saving is very much delayed gratification and isn't consistent with those lizard structures. Lizard structures want pleasure now. they don't have any ability to plan for pleasure in the future. So we've got to get into our higher structures and start to manipulate, manage, and drive new habits with those lower structures. And that requires a lot of work. So that's the way I structured my book, Brain Health Action Plan, was to exploit the knowledge of those structures so that we can drive new habits, because our default is just to stay in the habits we have and operate out of fear of the new and the unknown and the uncomfortable. And it's exactly the same with financial planning. You've got to get up into the really higher parts of your brain, visualize, plan, and utilize those higher abilities that we have that animals don't have.
There's two really good books I've read over the last 10 years on habits. One is Atomic Habits by James Clear, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Mm-hmm. And the other one is by Charles Duhigg. And the name of the book is going to slip my mind. But just listening to you think about that, I know Charles had drawn this diagram, this habit loop, where mm-hmm. there's like, if you want to change your habit, you've got to change. There's like, I'm going to really screw this up, so I'm going to have to link this to the show in the show notes. But you have to figure out like what to trigger the reward, and then substitute one of those in order to be able to make a change. And I think what I struggle with is if you're just up against this wall of fear or wall of worry, I wonder, how do you break that down?
That's a great point. So there's three main things we're doing to retrain ourselves when we're trying to make a new, better long-term decision. So one of them would be thinking about, we have this also, which I didn't talk about, but there's this diffuse network throughout the brain that's called the default mode network. And that is really the basis of what you think about yourself, what you think you are, what you think the world is, those preset beliefs. And so when you talk to people who, do vision workshops or set an intention or do affirmations, that can sound woo-woo, but really what that's tapping into is this diffuse network. And where that helps is if you say, for example, I'm going to start exercising. A lot of your listeners will relate to the fact that that is a really hard new habit to build. And just deciding to exercise most of the time isn't enough. Part of what you have to do is reset your default network. And that may be an affirmation in the morning where I'm a person who exercises. I'm a person who's fit because I exercise. It doesn't have to be true yet, but you have to change the mindset. So mindset is a really important part of all of this. If we look at, I need to call Paul, I've been referred to Paul and I need to call him about my financial situation. The affirmation of, I make wise financial decisions for my future. I make wise financial decisions for my family. That helps to get over that fear of the shame and the negative feedback loop from calling, because I start to act consistently with my default mode, right? So, it really can sound fluffy, but it's important. It's a brain network. It's not an imaginary thing. It's a brain network. So we have to tap into that. And then a lot of what we talk about in Atomic Habits, and really any book on habits will be similar, is you have to start driving those basic structures, that basal ganglia, with new habits. You have to start tiny habits and get a bunch of repetitions in. So I usually fall back to exercise because it's something people can relate to. We set a New Year's resolution that we're going to start exercising, some vague, huge goal. Has to be broken down. So, I'm going to exercise for 30 seconds every day this week. 30 seconds. It's absurd. Okay, am I going to stand up and do 5 squats? Sure. That's exercise. If you can start small and repeat it, it will get into those basic structures. So that may be, for financial, it's a little bit harder for me to know what would be effective, but, it's kind of like when we look at an IRA, and I've seen some of those projections where you put a little bit in every month, and by the time you're 65, you have millions of dollars.
Yeah.
The earlier you
it's
start.
Einstein's eighth wonder of the world, the power of compounding. And that's actually been a topic I've been bringing up to families as I go through our annual planning review season is that, I've started working with a lot of the parents I work with, their kids, and setting up accounts like this. And the numbers get pretty astronomical about, starting, investing when you're, 5, 10 years old, and just letting that compound. I think from my perspective, and just like exercise, what you don't want to do is stop the momentum or interrupt time. And so on that, from my aspect on the financial planning side, when you're younger, time is definitely on your side. Same way with exercising, like time is on your side. It's when you delay, that's when your flexibility gets taken away. Your options get more limited, if you will.
Yeah. And the procrastination on saving or adopting a new healthy habit is definitely something. So when you talk, first it starts with mindset, like the atomic habits. And then you want to get that benefit of time and start making changes as soon as possible. So you make small changes, they're repetitive. And then just like we would train a dog, we have to reward ourselves. We have to feed that positive feedback loop in terms of getting that habit built. With saving for your retirement, at least you can look at your retirement account, say, oh yeah, it's growing. Although those really
Most
exponential, right, that exponential growth you're not going to see right away, but you see some bit of it. You see it's growing, you see it's there. We also want to, like we would reward a dog with a treat, we want to reward ourselves for exercising for 30 seconds every day this week. The problem is one of our default rewards is food. So we don't want to, do our 5 squats every time we get up from the computer and then have, a handful of M&Ms every time. So we've got to think of positive rewards. So for me, for a lot of people, I love to be creative. So I like to tie, a bit of exercise or taking a walk with maybe just sitting at my workbench for 5, 10, 20 minutes, whatever predefined reward that is, and doing a little bit of macrame, tying knots, or even sitting on Instagram and looking for new knots that somebody else is tying. So setting up a non-food reward system to train yourself. It sounds simple, and I don't mean we should treat ourselves like dogs. Although if you saw my dog, you'd want to be treated like my dog. But it requires actually training. So that's where I think the lizard part kind of falls off, because we don't train lizards.
Right.
But we do have to give ourselves positive reinforcement to try to shut out that negative fear, anxiety reinforcement that can come in.
It's almost because of how we are, our brains are literally hardwired over, millions and millions of years, because, we millions of years ago, we didn't think about the things we're thinking about now. It was all about survival, but our brains have never really are continuing to evolve, I guess, and maybe that's the right word. And so it's like, in listening to you, it's like we have to work even harder to get over that initial negative wall of worry.
We do. And one of the things, it seems like, well, why don't we just stay in our prefrontal cortex all the time? Why isn't that our CPU or our control system? The challenge is we do get decision fatigue. If anybody's ever, remodeled a house, what that feels like.
Yeah.
We really can't function in it all of the time. So we've got to get up there, make decisions, make plans, but then build those into habits. Because as you know from Atomic Habits, most of what we do every day is a habit. We're not thinking of how we brush our teeth. We're not thinking of pressing on the gas, pressing on
Isn't it like 80%? Like we just kind of run on autopilot? Is it that 80-20 rule?
Yes. So we can't just think, I'm just going to decide all of this all the time. We've got to get up there, decide, reset our mindset, and train ourselves into these habits, because it's just exhausting. That part of the brain takes a lot more energy. And we haven't evolved to where that's taken over the old structures. We've just got to use those to reprogram those deep structures.
And I know that this is kind of like off topic, but maybe on topic. Is this where like anxiety, people that struggle with anxiety can build, because their prefrontal cortex, if you will, their planning is like completely getting overwhelmed, and it's hard for them to take a step back?
Yeah, it can be. And, those negative feedback loops are so easy to reinforce.
Because
And so
again, they're much harder. The negative feedback loops are much easier to reinforce than the
yes,
positive ones.
100%. 100%. And so it's where you'll also find the behaviors that we go to instinctually to try to get out of anxiety. We're trying to shift over to the positive system, to the dopamine. But some of the things that really supercharge dopamine release are sweetness. So that can get us into overeating, overindulging on sweets. Gambling releases dopamine. A lot of drugs release dopamine. Gaming releases dopamine. So it's where you'll see some of the really negative responses to anxiety, to fear, can go into behaviors that actually reinforce the negative feedback loops, because then we're not happy with ourselves. So we can, those structures and a lot of our activities and behaviors that feed that lizard brain, they can even get the positive system working in a negative way, unfortunately.
So if I shift back, because I agree with your point with Atomic Habits with James Clear, like one of the, again, it's very hard, but I think one of my big takeaways from his book was systems over processes, and tiny habits over trying to make wholesale changes all at once. Why do these tiny habits work better than going all in? And because I'm also thinking that you going back to your New Year's resolution, I think it's like by like February 6th or 7th, like everybody's already thrown in the towel on those New Year's resolutions.
Yeah. And the gyms love it because they get a big boost in income that they don't ever have to provide services for. So the reason that the small habits work so much better than the big habits is because when you're starting them, you just have to repeat them as quickly as you can and as many times as you can. So the smaller the habit, the more likely you're going to have success and be able to repeat it. So it should be tiny. It needs to, we talk about like SMART goals where they're specific, they're measurable, they're time bound, because part of setting those is then you can tap into the positive reinforcement system because you're accomplishing the goal. That does give you a positive feedback. Part of the big goals is that we all have experienced failing at big goals before. And so it immediately taps into the negative feedback loop. We're fearful that we're going to fail again. And that fear of failure is one of the strongest drivers of human behavior and human habit. So that's why we've got to make them tiny so we can repeat them and get them laid into a habit as quickly as possible, and get the positive feedback. And that's why I like to start with the SMART goals and make them tiny, so absurdly tiny that if, you're going to get up and do one squat, you can't not do it. And the likelihood is that if your goal is to do one squat every day this week, you're probably going to do 5. But by the time you do one, you'll do more. And you're not only meeting your goal, you're exceeding it. And then that starts to really reinforce positive new habits.
So I'm curious to stay on this topic. I'm curious to know like how you work with your patients on breaking down that bigger habit into tinier habits.
Yes. So it's a lot of the
reason everybody's different, but do you have like a process or a system that you use to be able to do that?
Yeah, I assess people's readiness to see kind of what area they want to make changes in first, because it's not always realistic to, change your diet, change your exercise habit, be sleeping better. And a lot of times we'll find an area where if you're sleeping better, I was floating around my desk. If you're sleeping better, it'll be easier to cut down on sugar because your hormones that make you crave sugar will improve if you're sleeping better. But I always break things down to small habits. And I did that throughout the book. They're really some of them are absurdly small habits. I keep coming back to squats or modified push-ups or If you're not walking at all, walk to the end of your driveway and back. Walk to the end of your hall and back in your building. Getting a little bit of a change is way better than thinking I'm going to set aside an hour and start exercising. It's just not going to happen. It's not the way our brain is wired. So I try to assess what area we might have the most success in making some tiny changes and then build on those. And I encourage people to do streak goals. There's trackers you can put on your phone. I like pen and paper. I tend to leave those, by my sink. So I see them first thing in the morning. I see them when I go to bed. I love checking off the box. You can do it on a calendar, but making it visual and then having it where you're already doing other habits. I know you're brushing your teeth in the morning and at night. And so you're going to see that habit tracker or streak tracker right there. So that's generally how we start. I try to find out, where people are and then make tiny changes from there. It should be customized to where we are. We always talk about having an affirmation though. It's really critical to consider mindset because that prefrontal cortex does need an ally to help it. So we're making changes and then we take some of the decision burden off of that prefrontal cortex when we know what our baseline is, how we perceive the world, how we perceive ourselves.
What have you found to be able to help people get over the, I guess, lack of what better term, like woo-woo effect of this positive self-talk? Because it is very important, obviously, from a mindset shift, but how does one even get started with that?
Yeah, I think that for a lot of people, they don't realize that mindset, it's structural in the brain. And so that's helpful for people, to realize it's kind of like that self-help genre of books. A lot of people are really turned off by that, and I understand it. But what people are tapping into is neural networks. So for me, because I understand the anatomical, the physiological basis of it, it's not as woo-woo or phony or whatever that's going to be. It can get that way, and I understand that. So talking about what an ally mindset is with our higher human cognitive functions, and they can get worn out. And when we talk about decision fatigue, I think it's really relatable. People have felt it for one reason or another. And so to understand that we can kind of ease that a bit by just a simple reminder in the morning. And sometimes maybe a reminder is a better way to say it than an affirmation, but it does help when you're thinking about something to eat and you have that in the back of your mind. Like, I make brain healthy decisions every day. And I look and I go, yeah, you know what? A chai latte is not part of making a brain healthy decision. It's just another task, another tool to have in our toolbox. It's a really powerful one. And I've seen a lot of people who do their 5-year, 10-year goal setting, their planning, and those are people who succeed. And I've seen people who do that and they meet their goals way ahead of their 5-year or their 10-year. So, it's powerful. I think when we go through life and we're not actively making decisions, deciding how we want our future to be in terms of health, in terms of finance, we look back and it's been 10 years and we've not done much. One of the things that I always have in mind is I think, what do I want to be? What do I want to look like when I'm 90? I'm planning to live to 90, maybe 100. Our generation will. So I'm not living today like I'm going to die at 60, although that could happen too. But I have the opportunity in my practice to see people who have lived in varying manners and the results of those. And so I imagine myself as one of those 90-year-old grandmas doing kettlebell swings on Instagram. That's who I want to be. I want to be fit. I want to be sitting on the floor with my grandkids, maybe great grandkids someday. I want to be able to move around. I want my body to be functional. And so when I think about that, I could just be going through life, but what's that lady doing right now? She's not sitting around eating a bunch of sugar and not exercising. That 90-year-old today is exercising. She's eating right. She's getting good sleep. She's thinking about her future. She's financially planning because she's going to live a long time and wants to be independent. So, when you start with the end in mind, with the future in mind, it helps drive my decisions today. Because I don't think I can get to that lady by just not thinking about it. I think it's an active pursuit of health, financial security, all of that. So, I think it's really powerful. I don't think it's woo-woo at all to think, what do I want to look like when I'm 90, when I'm 80, when I'm 100, whatever it is. Think about that. What does it take today to get to that point? That little lady doesn't live with family because she's out of money. That little lady invested and she's independent and she's doing the things she wants to do and she's traveling. So all of those require behaviors today. And that's part of mindset. So, that's a way to look at vision that's maybe not an affirmation, but it's like, what's that lady doing today? She's making good choices that are healthy, financially responsible. That's how I look at it. I don't want to get there and have an unknown. I want to be doing everything I can to be that lady someday.
That's really interesting what you're pointing out because, and I think I don't know if I brought him up in any of our previous conversations, but Hal Hirschfield over at UCLA has done like a lot of research on this. This is Hal's like baby. Like he wrote the book, Your Future Self, and they did a lot of testing with taking your current picture and aging it to like, so I'm 48 and I use this software and it makes me look like, projects what I'll look like at age 90. And when you do that, when you see that, it triggers something like you're just talking about, and you have a front row seat to this because most of your patients you work with are older. So you see that every day. But for those of you that don't, it's to be able to see a photo of your future self through Hal's work can be a really big trigger within your mindset to think about how you want that future self to be, which tends to help you make better decisions today.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Some people even talk about like stealing tomorrow's joy for today. So if we're making decisions that are all just in that instant gratification loop in our primitive brain, we are stealing tomorrow's joy. I want joy today and joy in the future. That might mean I'm getting less instant gratification. I'm not eating everything I want to eat all day long. I'm not just having ice cream sundaes all day long. That would be, the ultimate instant gratification all the time. That would be a great example of stealing tomorrow's joy. I'm not going to have good health in pretty quick fashion. So, that balance between today's joy and tomorrow's joy. But like you said, I've seen so much at my office and I know what I don't want to do when I'm older. So it's a really important goal for me to have great health along with longevity, not just a long, unhealthy life.
So as we kind of wrap up our conversation on this topic about health and why people are afraid to take the first step, what would be that one key point or action item, Dr. Teryn, that you would like to lead people with that they can potentially take away and begin to implement in their lives today?
I would say you can train yourself to make the decisions you want. You can train yourself to have the future you want. And it takes really those two things: having a mindset, having that mindset goal, and then using your decision-making brain to break things down into tiny habits and start doing them. And make them as infinitesimally small as you can. When you get them small, cut them in half and start those on repeat to trigger new habit formation. It's really powerful.
I had a feeling you were going to say tiny habits.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Teryn Clarke, thank you again for being on the show this week. And again, listeners, if you have questions for Dr. Clarke, feel free to email those at the show on our website. We'd love to get your feedback and any topics that you would like us to cover specifically for Dr. Clarke. Get those to us as well. And we love your feedback and we want to make that part of the show. So thanks, Dr. Teryn, and we will talk to you soon.
Yeah, see you next time.
I would say if you haven't picked up the Atomic Habits book by James Clear, I would get a hold of that. That book covers a lot of what we talked about today. The other book I referenced, and both of these are in the show note links that you can access, is The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. Both those books talk about this feedback loop that Dr. Teryn and I talked about. I think one of the main takeaways is that we have to work overtime because these negative feedback loops are much stronger than the positive ones, which again, that's what makes change difficult. So how do we compound this? I think as Dr. Teryn closed and really emphasized this point is that striving to build tiny habits is much more successful, I should say, than trying to start with some big audacious goal. We've got to start with that big audacious goal, but the only way we're probably going to have success in achieving it is the ability to break it down into smaller and smaller bite-sized pieces. Now that you've made it to the end of another great conversation, are you looking for more? If so, head over to tamacapital.com where you will find all of our conversations. Use the search feature to find the topic or guest you would love to learn more about. Also, don't forget to make someone else's day by sharing our show. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.